Good morning. Good morning, Senator Maroney. Good morning, Nick.
Morning, Tim.
Good
It'd be
morning.
hard to keep up with you all. You keep coming up faster and faster.
Meeting
George,
three.
good to see you. George,
Good morning.
morning, sir.
Morning, George.
Good morning, MJ.
Hey, Tim.
Harry, it's good to see you up in the right corner of my screen. How are you? Good morning.
All right. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. We do have a nice full agenda today. All right, MJ. How are we doing? Do we still have people in the waiting room, or?
The waiting room is slowed. There's no one else is entering. We're good.
Okay, and are we on CTN?
I believe they should be in here. Yep, we're on YouTube live.
Okay. All right. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. This is the November 15th meeting of the Connecticut AI Task Force. As I said before, we have a very full meeting, as we always do, it seems. So I will just briefly go to my co-chair, Nick, to see if you have any remarks.
Welcome, and I look forward to learning from you all. So over to you, Senator, and let's get the show on the road.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Okay. With that, our first speaker today, I apologize, I'm going to have to get some water, but our first speaker today is Chloe Audio. Chloe is right now an independent AI policy and governance advisor. She's been working with AI and tech for, she has over a decade of experience working in AI tech policy and governance. I was fortunate enough to be on a panel with Chloe this summer at the NCSL conference. It was offered many insights. She's a phenomenal resource. She's going to talk to us today about the recent executive order from the president, and then also bring us up to date on some international developments. Chloe?
Great. Thank you so much, Senator. I actually have slides to share. So let me just quickly figure out how to pull those up.
MJ, can you make sure she can share the slides?
Yes, she should be able to.
Should be good. Hang on a second. Just gotta get back to my main page here. Boink. Okay. Good. Excellent. Okay, great. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chloe Audio. I'm an independent AI policy and governance advisor, as Senator Maroney mentioned. And what I do is I consult with a number of organizations sort of all across the AI policy and governance ecosystem. These include one of the big AI labs, a couple of large tech companies, some public sector clients, and then a few nonprofits that are also sort of contributing to work on AI security and red teaming, that sort of thing. I spent about 4 years at Intel Corporation about a decade ago, setting up one of the first responsible AI programs in a technology company, and also worked on a lot of different policy initiatives related to AI and digital policy and privacy. So I've sort of been part of AI policy discussions since before they have captured the mindshare that they have today. And so I'm really excited to be here with you and share some of my perspectives and observations. But as Senator Maroney mentioned, really just talk about primarily the executive order on AI. So without further ado, we'll jump right in. I'm going to talk sort of about the policy landscape at a very high level. We'll think about implications both for states and industry, as I sort of understand that that's the majority of folks on this call. And then I'll take about 10 minutes for Q&A. And some of the slides are sort of content heavy, so I'll breeze through them. I really want to, reserve some of the time for discussion, but looking forward to your thoughts and feedback at the end of the presentation. So this is probably not a secret to anyone, right? The AI policy landscape is very complex and it's maturing. And it's really important, I think, to note that these developments are really driven by new and changing societal, corporate, and market expectations regarding how technology should and shouldn't be used, right? We've seen this with the writers and actors strikes, although those have finally wrapped up, lawsuits from various authors, and then, just the advent of consumer applications like ChatGPT getting into the hands of consumers and becoming really fast growing apps. So this is all to say, consumer expectations vary sort of widely on a macro and individual basis about what regulation should look like and what technology norms should be. But there is now sort of a broad consensus, and this has been demonstrated in a few polls, that among the American public and sort of a lot of Western countries, that there needs to be some sort of regulation for AI. And to sort of contextualize all this activity that's happening, I think it's really important to sort of sort these categories of activities into three buckets. The first is obviously policy and regulatory initiatives, which are really moving away from investment strategies toward practical frameworks and tools for regulation. The second is standards bodies, which are at the same time really trying to craft their own voluntary risk management frameworks. And we're seeing this at a global level through organizations like ISO and IEEE, but also in country level. So at NIST and in China, there's a lot of sort of, nascent standards work for different countries. And then obviously we're seeing new legal precedent, right? Regulators and enforcers like the FTC are pursuing AI oversight through the enforcement of existing laws, either anti-discrimination laws or civil rights laws, but looking at sector-specific privacy laws too. So this is just sort of a snapshot. I think it really helps me contextualize and sort of think about how to organize work and activity, because there is really, really so much happening. So next, we're going to dive into some global AI policy developments. And while we could boil the ocean with everything that's happened in the last 6 months or so on AI policy, there are sort of three top of mind updates that I wanted to cover today, particularly that have bubbled up in the last 3 weeks or so since the beginning of the month. And obviously the first is the UK's AI Safety Summit. There was a massive summit in the UK who has really said that they want to be the leader in AI safety. And they created an AI Safety Institute and a number of sort of declarations and agreements out at Bletchley Park, bringing together about 29 countries who will coordinate on the best practices, development, and sort of different codes of conduct related to AI safety. A lot of this is still very high level and sort of to be determined, but it's interesting that the UK has taken this lead, and now other countries like South Korea and France will champion the hosting, I guess, of further AI safety summits, and the global sort of rodeo of AI safety summits will continue. We'll put it that way. Next is obviously the EU AI Act, which is in the process of the trilogue discussions where the three branches of the European Union are sort of coming together to negotiate what exactly this text, the final text, will look like. And in the last couple of weeks, there have been a few sticking points, primarily related to enforcement and generative AI. Obviously, generative AI has sort of thrown a wrench in the EU text development process. How do we treat general purpose AI systems? Do we red team them? What kind of text will be adopted related to generative AI, and how are we going to define it? How are they going to define it in terms of high risk? Is any foundation model or generative AI model inherently high risk, or are we thinking about that more in sort of a use case application setting as the Act was doing sort of before generative AI became very popular? So these debates will continue. I have a note about enforcement here. I won't go too deep into that, but Kai Zenner, who is one of the primary negotiators of the Act, was at the IPP conference a few weeks ago up in Boston. And he actually said that, he feels positive about negotiations, but there is now sort of this 50-50 chance that the Act will pass before the EU Parliament elections in June, which from my perspective is a little bit less positive or hopeful than I think we've seen in the past when it comes to confidence in getting this Act passed quickly. So an interesting point to note. And then finally, we've seen leaders from around the world through the G7 come together and create a code of conduct for organizations operating within their countries. And this is obviously very high level, right? I'm sure anyone here who's looked at various sort of UN or other multi-stakeholder, multilateral agreements knows that these documents can be really, really high level. But it is interesting that all of these countries were able to agree upon and sort of put forth a document that referenced things like transparency and red teaming and specific sort of high risk mitigation approaches like those examples I just mentioned. So lots of global coordination on these issues, but really the devil will be in the details, and we'll have to see that through the development of standards, the EU AI Act vote and adoption, and obviously implementation of the executive order, which I will talk about now. Okay, so this chart is a bit of an eyesore, and I'm not going to go into everything here, but what I really want to do before I dive into a recap of the EO is remind everybody that the development of the EO did not happen in a vacuum, right? Congress, the administration, various agencies, and obviously state and local governments, military and intelligence agencies, were all working on AI-related policy and guidelines well before the development of the executive order. And actually, the executive order, you can sort of look at some of these activities and rulemakings and see where various agencies really inform some of the activities, and directives in the executive order. So it's really interesting, I think, just to sort of put all this in perspective. And while the executive order has been a really massive undertaking and deliverable for the Biden administration, a lot of this work was sort of already in process. And it goes without saying that in absence of, more concrete congressional action, it's been really, really wonderful to see how many states have, tossed their hat into the ring, friends in Connecticut specifically and elsewhere, to sort of understand and create a role for themselves and saying, look, we can tackle some of these issues too. It probably goes without saying, I'm based in Washington, D.C. I spent a lot of time working with policymakers and congressional staff. And I can say with certainty that we will not have, I think, any sort of AI law passed by the end of the year, whereas I think that was the hope for some for a while. So with all of the various congressional dynamics happening, I think we will need to rely on the good work of our state and local lawmakers to really be thinking critically about these issues from a legislative standpoint. Okay, so let's get into the executive order. There is a lot here, but I'll just give a quick recap and then we'll get into some of the details. It is the longest and most comprehensive executive order of the Biden administration to date. It's over 100 pages, I think 111 pages to be exact. And it's perhaps the most comprehensive related to tech and digital policy ever. I was chatting with Cameron Carey, who's the former general counsel at the Commerce Department in the Obama administration, and he had made this article or sort of take that really said, this is one of the most comprehensive EOs I've seen related to digital policy, and it really is sort of a testament of not only what a huge issue AI is for governments around the world, but really how much the Biden administration wants to lean into this. So it activates 50 different entities, regulatory agencies, different departments, defense agencies, sub offices within the White House. But the Commerce Department is really the organization that is taking on many, many new responsibilities. And NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which set up the AI risk management framework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is really going to be leading the bulk of this work through this AI Safety Institute that I mentioned earlier. So there is lots of work to do. There are over 150 different directives for agencies, and this could mean reports, guidance, opening new rulemakings, developing policies, sending memos to various leadership to be completed within the next 30 to 365 days. So with an election coming up and holidays, there is a lot of work to do. So it's going to be a busy year, and I will just note too that with one of the previous executive orders in the Trump administration on trustworthy AI, many of the directives in that executive order did not get implemented, and that was really because, for a lot of reasons. But for example, agencies cataloging AI use case. The Office of Personnel Management was supposed to write a memo about sort of the state of AI talent in the government. Some of these things just never happened. And obviously, that could be in part to the change administration, but also I think because there wasn't this, as strongly coordinated federal sort of strategy and approach through the White House on AI related issues. And that's no disrespect or criticism of the folks working on AI in the Trump administration. But I think with the focus from generative AI and the activation of this national security community within the federal government around these issues, there will be just a lot more focus on implementing this executive order and carrying these directives out. And I've heard that distinctly from a number of administration officials. And I just should note too, they'll also be leaning really heavily on engagement from private industry and state governments as well. Many times throughout the executive order, they mention, the need to collaborate with private industry, the need to collaborate with civil society, to collaborate with civil rights organizations, and different stakeholders throughout the AI ecosystem. So there's just so much opportunity to work with the government and the administration here. Okay, again, big slide. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want to highlight, sort of how I thought about analyzing this order. It has 12 distinct sections, and obviously some of them are introductions, some of them focus on some of these categories that I've laid out here. But I think it's really important to just sort of step back and contextualize and think about all of the different buckets that the order hits on. Again, national security being a big one, privacy, consumer protection, and IP being sort of another category. There are a lot of leaders at the White House right now, particularly in the technology team, with people like Deirdre Mulligan, who have worked on sort of privacy and consumer protection issues in the digital space for a long time. And you can sort of see their fingerprints and input really in this order. So it wasn't just about national security, despite that sort of heavy influence. Leaders from the White House and civil rights communities really did get some of these other provisions and directives in there related to equity and non-discrimination, labor and worker rights. And then we'll see a lot more sort of technology development and standard setting through NIST under the guise of AI security, or guise is probably the wrong word, but under the umbrella of AI security, which is generally sort of becoming to mean, technical standards, benchmarks, things like red teaming for AI systems. So we'll see a lot of that too. And of course, a big element of the order is bolstering the U.S. government's uptake of AI. So changing some immigration policies to allow for foreign-born students to make it easier for them to use their U.S. attained education in AI in the U.S. and contribute to the U.S. AI ecosystem. and opening up some more pipelines to hire talent. There's a sad statistic that I have to share, which is that not even 1% of AI PhDs, computer science and AI graduates in the US getting doctorates go to the public sector. So AI talent in the government is really, really lacking. And so this order is really focused on increasing uptake and retention, really, of talent in the government. Okay, shifting to some of the implications of the order. And again, I'm happy to share this last slide with folks. It's just sort of like a bulleted list of some of the things that I found most important or wanted to flag for this group. But even more so, I think important to flag are these various implications and engagement points for states and for industry. And so I'll talk about the states, industry, and with some key takeaways, and then we'll wrap it up. But some of the things that I want to flag, I think, for state lawmakers, anyone sort of working on AI in a state context, are a few things. And the first is this draft OMB guidance that was sort of a complementary deliverable to the executive order. The Office of Management and Budget at the White House has issued a draft sort of guidance document for feedback due December 5th to give agencies some new direction and opportunity to sort of figure out how they can not only adopt more AI, but do so responsibly. So this guidance includes things like the need to appoint a chief AI officer, so someone in charge of AI governance and adoption processes. This is really important and actually mirrors some of the stuff in the Connecticut bill and obviously activities that industry has taken to say, we need to have someone in charge of this. We need to make someone accountable. The guidance formalizes that for different agencies, and I think that's a really important step. It also sets up councils, like each agency needs to appoint and sort of create an AI oversight council and develop some minimum risk management processes. So it will be really interesting to see sort of how OMB coordinates these processes within and across agencies. And there'll be a lot of really interesting learnings and themes that will be super relevant to states and industry as well. But particularly, I think, state and local governments in terms of, how those processes have gone, what are the key findings, what dynamics are working, what aren't. So those will be really helpful. The second thing is some of this provision on investment and innovation. So the federal government, through the Commerce Department, will be coordinating the development of these new regional innovation clusters and working to fund and establish different types of what they're calling small business AI innovation and commercialization institutes. So it's a huge mouthful. But if you within your state or an organization working with state governments, getting involved with these institutes early and sort of understanding priorities, helping even set priorities will be really, really important. And then the last two, I'll sort of bundle them together, but essentially can be boiled down to guidance coming from one of these coordinating agencies via the EO. And the first point is the DOJ, which has been tasked with setting up some new guidance on AI use in criminal justice settings, and also advice on how to train different law enforcement officials on the use of AI and how to use it responsibly. So this guidance will be passed along to states, and I'm sure that the government and the DOJ will also be really interested in feedback on sort of how law enforcement use of AI has been going, key findings, best practices, particularly in the sense of responsible use. That's certainly something to flag as well. And then along the same lines, sort of the exchange of best practices and guidelines from the coordinating organization, the federal government, and the states is along the use of AI for provision of benefits and public services. So both HHS, the Department of Agriculture, and the DOT actually will all be developing their own sort of reporting and workstream and guidelines on best practices for AI use when it comes to public services. So definitely something to just sort of keep in mind. And I noted the section where all of this is covered here. And then last, although maybe less relevant to this group, I wanted to talk about some of the implications for industry. with a lot of the clients that I'm working for and sort of across the AI ecosystem, I think this EO made quite a splash, right? And we're seeing a lot of response, which is, oh my goodness, are we developing dual use foundation models? What do we have to do? Do we have to start reporting? By and large, the answer is no, right? The reporting requirements are very specific, and the thresholds that have been set actually, I think, were destined or determined not to apply to any foundation models in production currently. But it's really important to keep in mind that the executive orders can only go so far in requiring things of private industry, right? They're more a directive for agencies. And, the president relied on sort of two broad, but can be narrowly interpreted authorities here, the Defense Production Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, for some of these obligations for private industry. And I suspect we'll see some sort of, controversy and maybe even some litigation or, investigation about whether or not these authorities can actually apply or go as far as they're going. But I think it's, I just want to make sure to note that while the executive order is broad, again, it's very limited in what it can actually do in terms of requiring things of private industry. And by and large, most organizations developing or selling AI products are not going to have immediate implications through this executive order. However, like I said, the types of organizations in AI development that will be implicated and will sort of start need to be thinking about this stuff is any organization developing these dual use foundation models up to a certain threshold, and cloud service providers who are, providing compute to foreign entities that could possibly enable or use that compute for what the administration has called malicious cyber activity. So that's sort of the main immediate tier of, corporate or industry implications. And the other two here are a little bit more removed, but still important to mention. So the first is procurement considerations, right? If you're an organization selling to the government, thinking about selling to the government, a lot of the guidance that will come out of this OMB memo and the new requirements that agencies are going to have to adopt for AI risk management processes for AI will also apply to procured AI. And so if you're thinking about selling to the government AI products, AI solutions, starting to kind of take an account of your approach to, auditing, data mapping, what your use cases are used for, how you're scoping AI use cases for public servants or procurement officials will be really, really important to think about in light of some of the new changes to process and procurement within federal agencies. And then obviously the last one is the sort of new directive to enforcement agencies, primarily the DOJ, to coordinate new guidance for enforcement actions across enforcement agencies in the federal government. So the EO directs the DOJ to get together with other enforcement agencies, the FTC, the CFPB, the EEOC, and really take more of a focused look on, where can enforcement activities be applied in the AI context? Are there areas where we may need to clarify existing law? And really kind of come up with a strategy for how to look at various civil rights and non-discrimination harms in AI context. So this will be really important for employers to pay attention to. All right, we're almost done, and then I'll take questions. But now that I've provided this, roundabout of a really high snapshot of what's happened, what's been happening on the global level, and also with the executive order, I think it's helpful just to sort of step back and share some takeaways. The first one is that, obviously, as I mentioned in the first slide, regulation has moved from these abstractions of high-level principles to a lot more tangible and concrete actions. And we're especially seeing this along the lines of transparency with this new focus among responsible AI and safety communities on red teaming, which involves, external and third-party access to models, to data sets, providing access to models to really sort of interrogate what's going on under the hood. So we'll see more sort of concrete guidance, particularly from NIST, around what a good red team looks like or what a red team should look like. The second observation is that while we're seeing, more of these like abstract principles get turned into tangible guidelines, a lot of these proposals, particularly on the legislative front, are not self-executing, and they can often present really unclear and differing requirements for these terms that we all sort of use interchangeably, but are not always specific about. So fairness, transparency, safety, accountability, these all mean different things. And we're seeing this even in the context of these global leaders trying to sort of sort out new proposals for governance. Is it an AI safety institute? Is it an AI security institute? Are we promoting responsible use of AI? These terms are used interchangeably, and again, we'll need more sort of focus on the details to really advance concrete practices. I think the next two are sort of the most important observations that I want to share as I wrap up here. And that is that this new focus on generative AI and sort of existential or future risks has really pulled focus from these traditional governance and regulatory and compliance approaches to AI that we were seeing in the past, 5 to 10 years. When I started working on AI governance at Intel, much of the discussion was, okay, how do we understand what we're using AI for? How do we catalog the data that we want to use to put into that system? How do we manage risks with specific use cases and sort of think about what could go wrong, right? It was this sort of step-by-step process that could be somewhat linear. But what's happened with generative AI is that it's so hard, really, and impossible in some cases, to actually track and understand where data is going into these models. And so and to really predict, what they can be used for, right? Particularly with the language model, the risks can range from something very small to these sort of future risks related to, a large language model saying something about how to, take someone's life or develop a nuclear weapon or hack into a critical infrastructure system. And so the threat landscape has just really, really changed. But the result of this has been that, in and across sort of regulatory and compliance discussions, we almost lost track a little bit of the AI that is causing harms today, right? Basic machine learning models that are making decisions about access to loans or, whether or not you're going to get a house. And so we can't lose sight of that. And I think that's something that I really want you all to take away from today. And the last, I guess, number 4, leading industrialized nations, they're all really competing right now to demonstrate leadership in AI. Again, we saw this with the announcements in the first week of November, right? The executive order was announced on October 30th. We had the AI summit on the 1st, and the principles from the G7, I think, that Tuesday as well. So all of these countries, all of these organizations are, wanting to lead in this technology and put their foot forward first. And it really is creating sort of a geopolitical dance, right, for any sort of multinational organization using data, using AI to figure out, how do we balance our equities and how do we prioritize different initiatives and requests, particularly to things like model access. And then last, this sort of goes along with the third point, but obviously, industry has a huge role to play in self-regulation, right? In absence of clarity around different regulatory proposals with conflicting and fragmented regulatory proposals and initiatives, industry has a huge role to play in regulating itself, regulating models, red teaming, things like this, beyond just technical compliance, but it will never be a complete solution. And so on that note, I will turn it back to you, James, or Senator Maroney, and for questions. But really want to reinforce how important it is that we have so many dedicated public officials and procurement officials and state lawmakers so focused on rolling their sleeves up and working on these issues. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Chloe, thank you so much for that presentation. And we'll take some questions now, and then hopefully you would be available to answer questions by email or otherwise afterwards.
Absolutely.
So, okay, great. So we're going to start. Vahid?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Chloe, for this wonderful presentation. It was very informative, but at the same time, led to a lot of questions. I'm going to be selective, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask a couple of quick questions. I come from a technical background. I'm not a legal expert, so apologies if this is a naive question, but is it correct to assume that the majority of the efforts in the regulatory text is on putting the burden of responsibility on the creator of the AI system and not the user of the AI system?
I would say yes, in the context of this executive order and a lot of the new proposals that we're seeing that are targeting generative AI. In the past, or maybe not past, but sort of pre-generative AI, when we were talking sort of more about that traditional governance, regulatory compliance approach to AI use cases. I think sort of a more natural inclination came to look at this like we have, or some countries have, with privacy, right? There's the processor and the controller, or the developer and the deployer. But generative AI have sort of like turned that on its head. And so I think we'll continue to see, rules and regulations developed in a sector or industry specific use case, which will often fall on the deployer. But right now there's so much focus on, these highly capable foundation models and how they're being developed and what type of capabilities they have, and understanding those better, that focus, I think, will remain there for a little bit longer. But I think eventually we'll come back to sort of the deployer model, and we'll see a lot more regulation on a sector and industry specific use case basis.
Thank you, Chloe. If you don't mind, I'm going to follow up with a quick question. There's been quite a bit of discussion in the technical AI community about definitions and certain criteria put forward in the executive order. For example, the number of parameters in the model being included in the defining criteria of dual use foundation models. Have there been any legal challenges or legal issues raised in the legislative community or from major industry actors in response to the White House executive order on AI?
Not that I'm aware of yet, but as I mentioned, there is some debate about whether or not the authorities cited in the executive order actually allow or can require the type of reporting that is asked for. So I think it'll be sort of a TBD issue there. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Dave?
Thank you so much, Chloe, for your presentation. I appreciate that. I'm wondering if you can just tell us from within the executive order if it addresses at all the difference in transparency requirements between government agencies that deploy government created systems versus private organizations or private contractors that the government then hires to then use those private models to make decisions. Is there a difference in the transparency models between this, or do you get a sense from the executive order?
Yeah, that's a really good question, an important one. My understanding is that this will be sort of sorted out in the OMB guidance that will be finalized and then adopted by different agencies. That guidance talks specifically about, needing or creating the capability for models or data or just AI systems generally, I think is the term that they use, to be auditable, and maybe have access to data, have some sort of third-party oversight. But it's not clear to me yet whether or not, what happens for agency-developed AI will be, how it will be distinct from what the requirements are for procured AI. But generally, I will say that right now, there aren't clear standards. And I think if you're any sort of procurement officer or seller, government vendor, you're aware of this. There aren't clear standards whatsoever about, risk management or guidance for AI being procured or bought by the government. And so this is one area that I know that the White House is really, really focused on, and actually wanted to address with the Bill of Rights, but weren't able to sort of feasibly do so within existing authorities.
Yeah, and if I could just follow up quickly on that. Just given your work as a consultant, can you speak broadly about private industries stance on this? Because I know in the past there have been a lot of arguments over releasing any kind of private model to scrutiny because of the trade citing trade secrets and stuff like that. So do you can imagine that being a continued struggle moving forward in terms of transparency from private industries?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the trade secrets, confidential information, they're going to get, exceptions for all of that. And I think the government, for the most part, understands that. I think where the tricky issue will come in is whether or not governments will ask for things like model weights, right? Which are, veer on proprietary, but each of these models, right, have different levels of sort of safety filters. It's the base model. Is it, has some baseline safety filters related to replication or CSAM, child exploitation material, or are we going to, provide access to a model with, full sort of the standard safety filters where, you can't access the base model or these exceptions, but you generally can sort of see how things work. I think that most organizations right now are sort of, especially those who are the handful or the few that are developing or have these models, are kind of in the process of figuring out, what type of access are we willing to grant and how, and via what type of platform, that sort of thing. And between the safety institutes in the UK and the US, I hope we'll see some more clarity on that. But I think we'll continue to see debates around, what kind of access makes sense, in what context, for which models. There are so many factors, right, that will go into these decisions. And I think that industry and government alike are really trying to get more specific about what those factors are.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dave. And then I believe Nick.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Chloe. Very much appreciate your time and effort here. Maybe you should start every presentation off with no AI is used to put this presentation together. And, maybe set your own new standard for presentation skills. On a more serious note, Chloe, what else is the president doing? Did he not establish some form of an executive council similar to PCAST, on the AI topic? And is that something that we should be paying attention to in terms of who's on that either council or advisory group? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, at a very high level, because the timeline for the White House AI Council has not yet been released. I do know that it will be chaired by Bruce Reed, who has been one of the primary advisors coordinating a lot of this work, including the White House commitments that were announced, over the summer with 15 or so of these large AI companies. The AI Council will include leadership from all of the main agencies mentioned in the order, actually really across the government. And then senior leadership from the White House as well, and the president's cabinet. But in terms of, what that organization will be doing, primary priorities, again, timelines for when they'll get it up and running, I haven't heard much about that yet, but certainly something to watch and pay attention to, because, as I'm sure you're well aware, these coordinating functions within the White House really can set the tone and tenor for how all of this activity will shake out and priority setting. So TBD.
Yeah, and I think the role that industry or other non-governmental organizations will play could turn out to be very important in the way
Absolutely.
thing,
Yeah,
shapes
absolutely.
up and moves out. Very much like what's going on with the CHIPS Act
Mhm.
and the NSTC. I mean, that maybe is the model we should be looking at to see if that's the way this thing is going to roll. So again, Chloe, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Chloe, for that really thoughtful presentation. As we think about how it is that industry is really leading the charge here with not only with the use of AI, but just kind of stating the possibilities. And also, the executive order says something really interesting, which is that states should create an office, right? A way of kind of understanding and coordinating efforts to maximize opportunity, to really work with private industry, to understand how it can collaborate regionally and nationally. and multinationally. What I wonder is ultimately we as legislatures, as policy makers, are going to have to run to catch up with a lot of what's happening. And I'm wondering whether you have seen or know what the role of policymakers can be. You know, I'm thinking about equitable access. I'm thinking about civil rights, because this tool, unlike any of the other tools that we might find alluring to compare it to, is going to revolutionize how it is that we relate to each other as human beings, and also how it is that we exploit opportunity on this planet. So what are policymakers, and what's the best advice that you can give us or have seen on how it is that our policy shops need to integrate its thinking and doing into the conversation about AI?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. It's a really important question, and a question that I think anyone who's interested in sort of tackling this problem, right, is really thinking very critically and concretely about. One of the things that I would recommend if I was a policymaker or someone working in policy is really to meet or somehow like get involved with your local technology council, particularly to get exposure to some of the startups in your state and actually just understand like what they're doing with the technology. I'm obviously sort of come from a policy background, but what informed I think a lot of my career and what made my understanding of these problems so much more salient or tangible, things like bias and big data was what I started with in my career. It wasn't AI. It was like the social implications of computing and sort of how these systems work in, you know, the real world in physical contexts. But getting that actual sort of product understanding and experience is so important to understanding the implications of these systems. And so, you know, there's a lot of ways that that organizations do that in DC, right? They do things like sort of coming to the Hill and talking about you know, the technology and capabilities, but oftentimes it's in sort of these like high level like principles or, you know, talking about like use case implementations that don't actually like get under the hood and help you sort of understand, you know, how data is collected, what it then is used for, and how it actually works for the product, and then what the product does like out in the world. And so any exposure that you can get to that, and maybe this is something that I need to like set up somewhere, is some sort of like roundtable with you know, startups, you know, larger technology organizations, and then members of civil society. I've facilitated a number of these discussions, but it seems like, you know, getting this tangible understanding of like what AI looks like in the real world versus how it is covered in policy debates, they're sort of two different things, right? And so getting that exposure to what the product looks like, you know, what actually people are doing with data is so important. So any way you can get exposed to that, maybe, like I said, in Northern Virginia here we have the Northern Virginia Technology Council. It's a great organization. I'm sure those are, you know, similar organizations across your state. I'm not sure where you're calling in from, but you know, small business like associations like that, where people don't have the same types of resources as massive companies and organizations, but who are still interested in building something and creating these AI products. Like that's where I would really invest sort of my time and engagement and understanding. And like I said, Senator Maroney, maybe I need to figure out how to set one of these up or something, but yeah. I think that's where I would start. Yeah.
Chloe, thank you for that. And Senator, if just to follow up, that you've inspired Chloe, which is, you know, as we start understanding what the value proposition is, what the perils might be around the value propositions, ultimately the decisions that we're making in policy is relational. How is it that these tools are improving human relationships, improving access for human beings, equitable access to those opportunities? And I think that's where we step in as policymakers, right? Sure, I could look at AI that's being developed agnostically when it comes to, you know, expanding access and opportunity for peoples that don't have them, but we can't be agnostic in government, especially as these things are speeding ahead at the speed of light. And what I'm afraid of is that unless we are part of this conversation, we're going to continue to perpetuate a dual system, one of the connecteds and one of the not.
Yep. Yep, precisely. Yeah. And just another point, I sort of talked about like getting that tech exposure as being important, but the other part of it, and what you mentioned in your opening question too, is really about this civil society engagement, like consumer advocacy groups, like PTA boards, right? Like, how are kids using technology in schools, and are we okay with that? Like, technology has become the landscape of interaction is so broad now, right? It's everywhere. My kid has a computer at school, which maybe everyone's does now, but I'm like, what? That I didn't have that. So just sort of understanding where tech is being used and by whom, and engaging with those audiences, whether it's parents or nurses or mayors, right? Like that, I think that's really important too. And having a discussion with, like I said, these civil society communities who maybe are not tech experts. I think there's this, leniency or this tendency, particularly in DC too, to look at, and want to engage with sort of tech focused civil society organizations. And that's really important. But we also need to be talking to people who don't really understand the tech or aren't working with it all the time, but who are feeling its impacts, right? And so that's really important too.
Great. Chloe, thank you so much. Steve, thank you for those questions. We are going to touch on inclusive AI later on in today's presentation, and again on December 13th. And Chloe, I'll probably reach out to you for help. So our December 13th meeting of the task force, we do have some small businesses in Connecticut who have launched health tech products who are speaking. And at the end of that, the plan was to run 2 separate roundtables, one focused specifically on the businesses and health tech businesses, and then the other focused on workforce development. And Steve, to your point, that's really going to be one of the big goals of this bill, is making sure that, we have an opportunity, right? Where some people I've heard say we're only 1% of the way into this new tech revolution. As we build a new economy, how do we make sure it works for everyone, and that we're giving the skills to everyone to succeed and partake in this? There was another question that in the chat, unfortunately, we don't have time for that. I will send it to you. It was in regards to the practices that you're seeing state agencies governing the use of AI models for decision-making systems that impact provision of public services. The landscape looks like, in terms of policies and procedures for protecting citizens against replication of biased discriminatory practices. Steve, you touched a little bit on that, right? If we're using machine learning, we're learning from what we're doing now, we're picking up and amplifying those biases. But I will email that question to you. And then I did have a few questions, and just, again, for transparency, I like to kind of say out, and then I'll just email you to follow up. One, part of the executive order is defining the red teaming. You mentioned being a part of one of the nonprofits I think you're working with is focused on the red teaming. I'm just trying to figure out where that would fit within our Connecticut bill. Is it a specific requirement? But the other thing I'm looking at is cybersecurity safe harbor language, and would that be part of the safe harbor language, as well as the safe harbor language in our cybersecurity? It references several frameworks. So in addition to the NIST AI risk management framework, I'm also going to ask you about, are there other risk management frameworks we should be referencing in that, if we are to create a safe harbor provision within the legislation? Another thing was, you mentioned only 1% of PhDs in AI go into the public sector. I know we have the U.S. Digital Service. I was this weekend, I found out, or last week, I was at the TechNet conference. Colorado has created a Colorado Digital Services, which is a 2-year program. So I'm wondering if you have ideas, if that's something we should look at in Connecticut, how we could try to encourage more of the tech professionals to get into government work and public service. So that's another thing I'll reach out to you for your guidance on, if you're willing to provide that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator. Great questions. Quick yes to the USDS for Connecticut. And just to note to everyone here too, taking a look at what the state of California has done with their Office of the CIO, GovOps, a woman named Joy Bonagura. I don't know if she's there anymore, but this is relevant to the question from Adriana too. They've done some really interesting stuff with developing sort of their own risk management framework for different, data intensive projects in the California office of the CIO. So really, really great stuff there. And I can happy to connect or share more. But yeah, I'll answer questions over email.
Thank you so much. And we do have Delegate Maldonado from Virginia next, but then Assemblymember Bauer Kahan from California is going to be presenting on AB 331 in a little while. So thank you so much, Chloe. It's great.
Thank you so
seeing
much,
you
Senator.
again.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Take care.
And then next, Delegate Maldonado. Is she on the line? Oh, yep, I see her.
Yep, I'm here.
if you, and I apologize, we did get a little behind. I got us off to a late start, but we have with us Delegate Michelle Maldonado, who was recently reelected to her, I believe, second term as a Virginia delegate. She has been working with their AI task force and is a former tech lawyer before she started her public service. And so, as well as I am warning you, I'm considering you as a friend now since we've been talking on a lot of these issues.
Duly noted. We absolutely. You're in the friend zone.
So I would like to turn it off to you to just bring us a little bit of an update on what you've been doing within Virginia and where you see that going next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator Maroney. I am so glad to be here. And I have to tell you that being surrounded by all of you in this moment is really bringing out my inner geek and nerd around all things tech, which I love. But what I'm really happy about is that we are looking at this more holistically. So we have the responsible, ethical, trustworthy, and transparent, but we're also looking at sort of digital competency of our residents and how to make sure our residents, our consumers, our customer, all those folks who make up the people who live here in the Commonwealth, informed and notified when we are engaging with different, it can be AI, but other emerging technologies in this way. So let me just share a little bit about what we're doing. So I founded our Technology and Innovation Caucus last year, and this year was really concerned as a result of some things I was seeing coming or being rumored to come before the legislature, and seeing that we didn't have enough folks as legislators who understood technology. And that's part of what the caucus was, to help educate and provide resources and guidance and more information to our legislators to be better legislators in this particular space. This year, I launched it's bipartisan, bicameral AI initiative, which includes folks from the governor's office and agencies and folks in industry and unions and trades and academia. And I love the point that I think Chloe made about making sure we have people who aren't from tech involved in this conversation to have a more holistic approach and conversation. We also have our regional tech councils as critical partnerships and partners and participants in this effort. So where we are is our governor, maybe 2 months or so after we formed this, maybe actually it's more than that, after we formed our work group, had folks from his office join, he issued Executive Order number 5. And he's focusing on 4 key areas, which is around sort of privacy and intellectual property, guidelines for agencies, security, so around sort of cyber and firewalls, and then finally around the education piece. How are students using AI in the classroom? We thought there also should be the law enforcement piece that was not included. Once the executive order went out, that was one of the first sort of feedbacks that he got. And I think their office recognizes that there is more to do there. We did authorize in 2022 for our Virginia State Police to be able to use facial recognition technology under certain circumstances. And there's some tightening with that piece of legislation that needs to happen that the caucus may be bringing forward this year. So we have an executive order standing out there. which is starting to set the tone for some things at the executive branch level, and that's having the Office of Regulatory Management work with VITA, that's our IT agency, and through our CIO. And then we have JCOTS, which is our Joint Commission on Technology and Sciences. And the interesting thing about JCOTS is we actually have an AI committee or subcommittee on that commission that's done that. It's just on paper. So I spoke with the chair last legislative session this year and asked if we could sort of seat that committee, because we have more obviously fast coming work that's going to be needed to be processed through JCOTS. And so I have asked the chair, as well as our speaker designee, who will come in the next cycle, to consider fully funding a full-time staffing for that commission and seating the AI committee. Now, all of us, Republicans, Democrats, and folks on our steering committee that mirrors this one, agree that we need to do that, and it's fully supported and it's bipartisan. So we'll see where we get to on that, but that is one place we think we need to move. So we have a couple of different strategies, right? It's looking at sort of the infrastructure pieces in our commissions and looking at what agencies do, and then also looking at what can we do as a legislative body, and how can we provide guidance without, all of this is so new. So we don't want to be so restrictive as we're figuring things out that we stymie competition, innovation, and the ability to allow for this for all of us to do our due diligence. So a couple of things we're going to be looking at from the legislative side in the next session is mirroring the Child Online Protection Act that was passed in Connecticut and Colorado. We're looking to bring that forward. We do have a Data Privacy Act. We're one of the first to do that in the nation, and many folks have modeled theirs after ours. So we'll be looking to plug into that and make some things to tweak and tighten up now that we have more stuff happening in the AI space. And in Virginia, I don't know about all the other states, but I will tell you, when I was in law school, and I have not practiced law in a very long time, but when I was in law school, you are taught to reference the most recent case law to be your sort of direct authority on an issue. And in Virginia, I remember many, many times that most recent case law might have been from 1812. So in Virginia, we will pass law and we think that's the law forever. And so part of the mind shift, not just in Virginia, but I use Virginia as a really good example, but across the board, this is new and evolving. And so we have to really loosen how we think about how law is passed around these issues. And we may have to assess and reassess and fine tune over time. So we pass a piece of legislation. It may very well be that because the technology is moving so quickly, we may actually have to fine tune it and tweak it and amend it later. And people have to get used to that may be part of how we legislate going forward. So we're also working in companionship with the senator on something for deep fakes ahead of the 2024 elections. And we're also working on some things in the law enforcement space around facial recognition technology and automated license plate readers. And these places in particular, as you can see, there's this intersection around privacy and protections and preventing discriminatory impact. So we have those pieces as well. And we want to have work that allows for digital competency, as I referenced earlier, that begins to inform the public about how the government is using these things. Where do we and under what conditions should we be saying, I'm a bot, or I'm a whatever, or just notifying that AI or whatever is being used for that interaction, for that communication. I'm dating myself right now. I was a lawyer at AOL, and we played with chatbots. And let me tell you, we thought it was the greatest idea that, for those who celebrated and recognized Christmas, we do a chat box. They could go do their gift shopping, all these things that in the tech space people thought were phenomenal, and people were offended. They were like, wait, this is intrusive. I didn't ask for you to talk to me. And so we have to look at how do we allow people to choose to interact in these spaces where there's flexibility to do so versus the kind of algorithms that happen behind the scenes to make platforms work. All right. And so what does that mean? The other thing that we're looking at is that's critically important, I think everybody's touched on, is the pipeline of workforce development. In the government space, we lose almost every single time to the private sector. And so even in the private sector is having a hard time keeping up. This is widespread. So we need to put some things in place to help develop that pipeline, particularly for government purposes. And in Virginia, we have a workforce development agency that's kind of blooming. It hasn't formulated all the way, but my intention is to make sure that we plug into that so that we can make sure we have very strong, secure plans and resources and budget in place for that. And the other issue that you all have, I duly noted as well, is what do we do in terms of government procurement? So that is a place where we are looking at. I don't think all of these bills are going to go forward, but a good number will. And then I think what we have to do is also look at how our agencies and our VITA, our IT agency, how their research and study unfolds. I would love for us to kind of have a study done to look at some of these things more holistically, and that would be in our parlance kind of a Section 1 bill that establishes that study. But what I say to people is we cannot wait for a study to be done to do something. The recommendations from the study can help inform, and those recommendations can turn into legislation or policy or what have you, but we have to do something in the meantime. The one thing I think we can all agree on is that when social media came out, we did not do anything. Mark Zuckerberg was, a couple of years ago on the Hill asking for guidance. We didn't give it. And then just in the spring, we had OpenAI and ChatGPT folks on the Hill asking for guidance. And we cannot, whether it is at a state level or a federal level, we cannot executive order our way through this. We must have the appropriate broad spectrum infrastructure in place that's requiring all of what all of us are learning about, leaning into, and trying to establish. And then I think ultimately, one of the questions I have is we're seeing a lot of conversation around establishing an office, for this kind of work. Is that standalone? Is it under the IT agency? How does that look? And so I think those are some of the conversations because we need dedicated people focused on this. And AI is a funny thing, right? Because it's in everything. It's like technology is in everything. So I actually am not a fan of thinking it's just an AI role. It's a technology person who understands these new and emerging technologies and can keep up with the evolution of them as we move forward. So I think, those are some of the things. So looking at our JCOTS, looking at our subcommittee on AI and technology, looking at these pieces of legislation, potentially a study bill. And the one thing I will say about education, this is the one that's like really people are feeling, is that I think we have to really consider the question is not how do we keep our kids from using AI to write papers and all of these things. I think the question is going to be, now that it's here and it will be virtually impossible to prevent students from using this, is how do we educate differently? And some of it may be, one of the examples I shared at a recent panel I was on is perhaps you have a paper that's due and your students are going to, a good number of them may in fact use AI to generate their paper. So maybe some of the assignments become something like, go use AI, write this paper, come back in with the paper, and then there's no technology allowed in the classroom. And now you've got to make that paper better. You've got to so we won't lose the critical thinking. We won't use the writing. You have to kind of figure out. So they still have to write, they still have to argue, but there may be different ways how, to think about how we ask our students to leverage this technology to make sure we're not missing the skill sets that are so important for us to help them develop. So I I am going to pause there. I think, James, you had something about when you referenced the cybersecurity safe harbor and stuff. So I definitely want to connect with you on that piece of legislation, because I think there are some interesting things where we need to demonstrate flexibility as we figure all of these things out. But I will pause there. Yeah, I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much. Definitely made me think of a lot of things. I think in talking in the education, for a while they were looking at writing across the curriculum, right? And how to use writing in all of the different subjects, not just in your English classes. So it's almost like we need to get to AI across the curriculum, right? How can that be used with helping you? And again, just emphasizing AI is not going to take your job. It's going to be someone who knows how to use AI who is going to take your job, right? So we need to make sure that people have those skills. About
the jobs piece. So this one, I think we do have to be really careful about. So we are talking about upskilling people. But the other thing we know is that some of the low-hanging fruit, more mundane administrative functions that are often filled by women and people of color, those functions may actually begin to be automated because it's easier. And so there is going to be a knowledge economy that gets sort of morphed into a different way. So some of the fear around it will take my job may be actually not unreasonable to consider when we think about some of these lower hanging fruit administrative functions. So what we have to be diligent about is figure out where does the human element get repositioned, because some of that will happen for efficiency's sake and for cost saving sake. And I think that's what we have to be really mindful of as we look at this. And the question will be, some people may not want to shift and some people may not want to grow, but we have to make sure that as we allow this to evolve, that we are always thinking about the human factor, so that we are minimizing that discriminatory impact. This discriminatory impact won't just happen in the outcomes and outputs of algorithms. It will also happen in the replacement of certain job functions.
And that's excellent point. And it goes to something you say. This isn't an I problem. This is a we problem, right? You've said that before. I love when you say that. And this is something we do need to work together on. I think that's one of the keys that I want to look at is in workforce development, but in just making sure that we're including populations who've been left behind before. And so
yes.
One of the things that I will share out once I have that, I've reached out to Indeed. And Indeed is going to share with us the skills they're seeing in the job postings for prompt engineer and some other different careers. And then we're going to work with, hopefully with Amazon and our community colleges to develop some certificate programs. But I think that it's important we share that to all of our colleagues, in other states. It's not just a Connecticut thing. Again, this is a we problem. So as we work on that, I'll definitely make sure that we engage each other to get your help, and also in just figuring out, right, how do we make sure we're including everyone in the potential opportunities. So thank you so much for taking the time to present, and I'll bring what I've been working on. I'll have it down at SGAC this weekend. So I look forward to meeting you in person.
I do as well. I forgot you're going to be there. I'm so excited.
Yeah.
And I'll bring mine and we can brainstorm.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.
Okay. And next, we're fortunate to have with us Assemblymember Bauer Kahan from California. She's the prime author of AB 331, a bill that deals with algorithmic discrimination, and it's the leading, right now she's I'd say the leading voice for that in the country. So Assemblymember Bauer Kahan, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Maroney, and thanks for convening all of us. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm a legislator by day and a mom by night, and it's still morning in California, so I had to get my kids off to school. But it's good to be with all of you. It's so funny being here because one of, AI is, we try to act like we need to figure out where it is, but it's here today. And one of the things that I recently realized, and I see even on this call, is these autopilots that are appearing on our Zooms, and they're recording us. And I live in a 2 consent state. and I was recently on a closed door meeting where somebody was using autopilot to transcribe everything that was said in the meeting. And I realized I didn't consent to that, but it's this AI transcription, and how does that fit into our laws? And I think I wanted to point out, because I think it highlights, we have these laws that have worked for us for a long time. And as technology is changing, I think we need to make sure that what we believe is the status quo, as Michelle said about laws that have been on the books for a long time, that our AI applies to it. Now, this, of course, we consented to be recorded, so that's different. I appreciate hearing a lot of what Michelle had to say is happening in Virginia. I know many of us, if not all of us, live in states with significant tech hubs. My dad worked for Xerox forever for many years out of Stamford, Connecticut. So I know that our tech hubs are all over the country. We're all very focused on this as it relates to job creation, as we heard Michelle talking about, but also how it impacts our constituents. And the polling that is now being done, as I'm sure all of you are seeing, shows that our constituents are incredibly concerned about AI and our lack of regulation. And so it's really great that we're all having this conversation and getting on top of it. And I really appreciate what Michelle had to say about social media and the internet. I was on a panel recently with a colleague of mine who was arguing against any regulation in the AI space. And he said, well, we didn't regulate the internet and it revolutionized the world and nothing bad happened. And I responded and said, well, I'm actually pretty sure a lot of bad things happened. Would you like to start listing them? The demise of our democracy, suicide amongst our teens, like, where do you want me to start? So I do think that recognition of, the internet has been an amazing thing and it has revolutionized the world. And I'm not saying it's all bad, but I do think that the point of, our failure to really step in areas of high risk, like with our youth, we've seen the failure of that, and we're seeing it and trying to catch up at this point. I'm the mom of a teen, so I'm seeing it in real time, is really hard. And so I think this is a space where, this group of legislators is really seeing, let's not get behind the ball. And in some ways, I think we might already be a little bit behind the ball, but we're catching up. So I appreciate that we're having this conversation. By way of background, so I represent part of the Bay Area. I was born and raised in the Bay Area, although I spent many years on the East Coast. I went to college in Philly and then lived in DC for a while and moved back to California. I'm an attorney. I practiced law for 7 years. And then became a law professor before becoming a legislator. So I'm both grew up, my dad, like I said, is a physicist. I grew up in the labs of Silicon Valley. So tech is sort of ingrained in me, but I am a regulatory legal nerd. So this AI space is really where all of that background, I think, has converged for me in a very fun way. And I think, like many of you, when the blueprint came out from the White House and these conversations started to really bubble up, was when I thought, we don't have a ton happening in this space. And that was before dropping of ChatGPT, as we all know. But it became clear that we as legislators needed to start paying attention to it. And so, I started having conversations with the incredible folks at the White House who, I know many of you have worked with, but the resources they have that we cannot get at the state level, people who've worked in AI for their careers who are now moving into the policy space. I mean, it's incredible to be able to talk to them and learn from them. And the professors across the country, I think I saw someone on from UConn who are working in this space that are real resources for all of us. We started to have those conversations and figure out how could we dive into this in a really meaningful way, start to regulate it in the way that most impacted our constituents. And what we started to realize was that algorithmic decision-making was already prevalent in all of the impactful decisions that were being made across our lives. And 50% of those decisions were being made when we started this research a year ago by these algorithms. And so, that seemed to be a really great place because fundamentally we all agree on the premise here, which is, all of us and the federal government have laws that say you can't discriminate in these impactful decisions. And so we've got that foundation on which we begin. And if we can use these tools to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen on the front end, that's moving policy and our societies forward in such incredible ways. As a woman who comes out of big law, I know that when I walked into interviews in law firms that were very minority women led, I was at a disadvantage because people have bias, and that was happening when humans were making that decision. And if we can move these algorithmic decisions to a place where that bias is gone, then we've actually improved society, which is incredibly exciting to me. So we decided that was where we wanted to start. And in part, we were hopeful that it would be one of the least controversial spaces to regulate. Obviously, all of you are having these conversations with industry and the civil rights community. And what really we're butting up against is this idea that we should allow for innovation, because innovation is incredible and we want to move this technology forward, and regulation is going to stop or harm innovation. And then on the other side, the need to regulate and protect people. And these two things are butting up against each other. And so we really thought that these algorithmic decision tools would be a place where we could all agree. We're innovating, but let's do something to make sure they're safe before we deploy them. The bill didn't make it last year, so it may have been the least controversial thing, but I didn't get it to the finish line. It actually died in our appropriations committee, in part because I'm sure, like all of your states, we don't have the expertise and the regulatory heft at this point to actually regulate this, right? And that is something that as this technology advances, we have to build up as a state, and it is very hard to do. We are all going to have to find folks who can do that work, and it's going to take an expertise to do that. And so, that was really the piece we came up against, is how do we build up an enforcement arm that's meaningful, that can do the work we expect them to do to protect Californians. So I think that's a huge part of what we've been up against and we're working with our administration on. Like Virginia, our governor has done an executive order. He's incredibly engaged in this. He's meeting with our artificial intelligence community. He wants to both see that happen, but he also understands that our communities want the protections that are necessary as the innovation happens. So we're hopeful we can figure out that arm. Obviously, California, as many know, had a tough budget year last year. That didn't help. We expect to have one again this year. So I think that was a part of it. But I think also one of the things that I realized we have a committee called Privacy and Consumer Protection where all these bills come through. I've sat on the committee since my election in 2018. So I've been on for 5 years. I have a former colleague who had tried to move artificial intelligence bills years ago, and they all died because we couldn't define AI. That was it. We couldn't get past defining AI. And so I think that what was very clear to me was we had to get past this fight around what is AI and how do we define it in a static way? Because, it was interesting to hear Michelle say that Virginia doesn't like to change their laws. We like cleanup bills. We change our laws every year. So we are kind of the other end of that spectrum. We pass bills knowing we're going to fix them, which I think is insane, but I'm only one of 120. But how do AI is changing every day, right? And so how do you make a definition that meets what AI will be in a year and also not lump in things that we don't care to regulate, right? Like a calculator. So that has been the real challenge. And I think what was brilliant about the way the blueprint was conceived was this idea that the definition of AI is less important than the way it impacts our communities. And focusing on the harms and the impacts is how we should define the scope of the regulation. And it really got us out of this morass of what is AI, because it's less important if you only get regulated if you have an impact on a community. So I think that was something that we continue to really come up against, which is everybody wants us to change every definition in the bill. Everybody has a different version of what we should be saying as it relates to definitions. And I think one of our strategies has really been coming back to, okay, you don't like the way we defined X or Y, but you're only regulated as it relates to this impact question. And so let's really focus there, because that is the threshold question. So I think that's something we've been very focused on in California, and I think has been really helpful. Obviously, the scope of the bill, for those of you who have had an opportunity to look at it, the bill regulates all automatic decision-making tools that impact what we define as consequential decisions. The way we've defined consequential decisions is incredibly broad, but also, I think, narrow in that it really, if you read it, I think the layperson would agree everything we put in there is consequential: housing, lending, jobs, healthcare, the things that really impact our lives in meaningful ways, but the banking entities. But at the same time, we are wrapping in a lot of industry, and they all opposed it. So, and that has shifted. I will say we have some great corporate partners now who are coming on board, who are working with us, who had tweaks, but really wanted to see this come into play. And so, I do think that was one of the challenges we saw was, how do we really deal with every impactful decision while taking on every major industry? And I think that the way that I've really thought about that, and what I say to industries as I meet with them, and I've taken, I don't know how many meetings, but I don't know how many corporate entities, is, I think that what I'm asking of you is reasonable, right? The bill says that before you deploy one of these tools to make decisions for Californians, you just have to test it and make sure it's not discriminatory. And then if it is, you have to fix it, right? So I'm not asking the world of you. I'm not saying don't deploy it. I'm just saying test it, check it, and fix it, right? And so I think when you bring it back to that, the ask that many have had, which is take me out of the bill, feels unreasonable to me, because I think that we also know that in this space, many, many good actors are doing this testing today. The impact assessments to decide if discrimination is happening, and many of the big companies that are responsible actors. And so to ask you to do that before deploying it, I think is reasonable. So we've really focused on the fact that our bill is reasonable in its ask of these entities. And so, why do I need to take you out of this when what I'm asking is so reasonable? Now, I say it's reasonable. I know Amazon's on the call. They don't agree it's reasonable. So, I'll be honest about that. And there is, but there is really a split amongst industry about where they are and whether they want this. I think we hear, and you all know this because you sit in the same seats I sit in, we hear the ads on our podcasts with certain corporate entities saying, we want regulation. And then they come into every single hearing that we have in California and oppose every piece of regulation that would affect them. So there are, entities that don't want regulation, no matter what they say on Capitol Hill, and they're going to fight it to the death. And then there are folks who actually do want to know what the landscape is. They do want to know how to continue to grow their company in a way that they're not going to, 3 years down the line, have grown this company and realized, oh, shoot, we should have done it this way because this is what government wants. And so, there is this divide amongst industry of certainty is really helpful when you're a business person, right? And so I think that's part of what we're leaning into is we want to give you certainty. We want to help you understand what we expect of you in California. And I wanted to make that point because I think this, Senator Maroney, I'm so grateful for, because I think all of us would agree, hopefully, that a uniform set of principles for companies that are operating across state lines is the best option. I think we also all are very aware this is unlikely to happen in Washington.
Yeah.
So what do we do given that dynamic? And I think us working together to try to create consistency across state lines is the best thing for our economies, for our nation. And in the absence of leadership coming out of the Congress, us partnering and really working with each other is the next best option. So, I do really appreciate that. And so, I think that the jobs piece, when we talk about so we're trying to really get at this discrimination piece because I think it's important. I think it can move, the world forward in really meaningful ways for women, for people of color, as we seek these things. You think of home loans and how discriminatory those have been, like the idea that we can have an automated decision tool that pulls out the discrimination, if that's possible, is so incredible. Right? The opportunity is so amazing here. And so I do hope that we can move legislation that moves us to that future that is more exciting than the one we live in today. But, I think all of us know that this piece that I'm talking about, automated decision tools, is one piece of what AI is doing, is one piece of the puzzle. I think the jobs piece is such an important one for us to be talking about. I'm a former litigator. I often think of the court reporter. Almost every court reporter in my 7 years of practice was a woman of color or a woman. Those jobs are probably, we're talking about jobs that could be automated using AI very easily, very quickly. And what do we do with those people who have great jobs today, right? And how do we ensure that they have a future? And as I think about that, again, as my husband is a computer science major from Berkeley, graduated in 1998, into the world of the internet revolution, right? We never imagined, even in 1998, I think, how many jobs we would have in computer science. And we haven't created a computer science world that is equitable, right? I mean, I think all of us can look at the computer scientists and know, that there are certain underrepresented communities. And so I don't think any of us know all of the jobs that will be created coming out of this AI revolution, right? It is hard to predict, but I think it's really great what you're doing, Senator, to try to understand that as it's happening, prepare people for it, and create opportunity for everybody, because that is so, so critical. I also think we really need to, as policymakers, think about, there are places where replacement will happen, and maybe is something that we need to face. But there's also places where augmentation is the better option, right? You know, and I often use the example of my mammogram I get every year, which years ago was only read by a human, and now they use AI and a human, right? And they're seeing more things in those radiology reports. Well, that's, you know, that augmentation is helping prevent cancer, and it's not displacing jobs, right? And so how do we also use AI and really focus on augmentation? I'd be really nervous if you took that radiologist out of the room, right? So there is places as policymakers that we need to make sure we're not replacing human decision making where we think it's really critical for the ultimate decision, but we know that augmentation can make those decisions better. So, you know, I think that we need to be thinking and working in advance on all of that, and I really appreciate the shared information and the thought that's going to go into that, because I think it's critical to protect the jobs and the communities that we have before us.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a very important point you made about the tech workforce. I think it's only 26% female. And we're not even looking at people of color, the diversity there. And I think the symbolism that the UK AI Safety Summit was in Bletchley Park, where, you know, my son is applying for college, and Nick's heard me share this story, so I apologize, Nick, for redundancy, but my son's applying for college, and one of the questions is something you learned that's interesting. And he talked about Bletchley Park and when they broke the German Enigma code and how they recruited not just cryptographers, but puzzlers and chess players and non-traditional. And it's that just emphasizing that importance of including diverse voices, right? And multiple voices to get to a better decision and a better product in the end. And so I think that's why, how can we be more intentional and thoughtful as we're working in building this new workforce to make sure we're including all the voices. And another thing, you know, I just finished reading McKinsey. I didn't just finish, about a month ago. McKinsey has a book called Rewired, which is preparing CEOs for the digital transformation. My friend Nick there recommended that I read that. And one of the things that they talk about in terms of recruiting is that DEI is important to people coming out of college. They want companies who are embracing DEI, and the companies who do so see a 26% higher return or more profitable. And so it's not just the right thing to do, it's a better product, and it's what, you know, the future workforce wants. And so we need to make sure we're being more thoughtful and intentional. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's just,
no, I appreciate it.
For anyone who's listening at home who may not have realized that. So with that, I see we do have a few questions. I may ask a few questions in the end, or I may reach out to you separately. I want to model your impact assessment requirement. And again, talking about what gets measured improves. Right. And so we're not saying not to do things. We're saying you have to test it, make sure you're not, there's no disparate impacts. There's no heightened risk of harm that we're creating, and then have a plan to mitigate or eliminate that if you do identify the harms. Arguably in California and Connecticut, a lot of these companies are already required to do that from our Data Privacy Acts. And in, you know, Connecticut, I believe California is the same, that, you know, there already is an option to opt out of processing. For in Connecticut, we put solely automated, so which narrows it, right? Solely automated decisions you have the right to opt out of, because a lot of times is, you know, there'll be someone looking at it for the final decision, so it wouldn't count there. But anyways,
so you're ahead of us on that, Senator.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure if that piece was in the I couldn't remember from.
Ours is a bit older, so
yeah, it was 2 years ago I went through that. So I when I had read all the California bills. But the other thing is, for the structure, you are lucky in some ways that you do have the California Privacy Agency that I'm sure, and Maureen Mahoney, who now works there, was very helpful when she was at Consumer Reports with us crafting our Connecticut legislation, as well as, I should say, the California AG's office was very helpful to us. Stacey Chester was a tremendous resource. But with that, I'll turn it over to Nick, who has a question, and then Vahid.
Yeah, I think Vahid was before me, Senator. So Vahid, you go first, and then I'll clean up here. Thank you.
Well, I actually trust in Zoom's ordering. You were first, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go first. Thank you so much, Senator, and thank you, Rebecca, for this discussion. The text of the bill that you've authored or co-authored is one of the one of the cleaner ones that I've seen. It's a very concrete, it's broad, and it aims at a very specific target. I understand the issue around the defining AI. I'm one of the people on this task force who keep pushing for a more concrete definition of AI because I believe it's important when it comes to regulation and legal persecution if it comes to it. But my question is about the proposed testing and evaluation approach in the bill. I suspect that third-party assessment had been discussed when you were coming up with the text of this bill. What happened in that discussion? Why was it that the assessment ended up being left to the developer or the deployer?
So I'll be honest with you, part of what I'm really focused on there is we have very big companies that are in the space, Microsoft, Google, et cetera. In California, we really want small startups to be doing this. We don't want to leave it to the big folks. We think that more engagement in any space is better, right? Competition is good for the market. And so part of what my focus there was a couple things. One was, and I don't know if you have any auditors on this call, but I don't know how independent really is when the company is hiring them. I'm going to be honest with that. I've always been skeptical of that. So part of it is my own skepticism, but part of it also is cost. I'm going to be real with you. We want it to be meaningful. We're defining the scope of it. We want the agency to help us continue to define the scope of what needs to be done. And there's going to be checks and balances on that and enforcement. But we didn't want to make it so costly that it takes the small players out of this space, because we do think small businesses in the AI space is critical to competition and the future of artificial intelligence. If we make things so expensive and so difficult, we drive those players out of the market. And that's the last thing I wanted to do. But it's a great question, and it is something we had a real debate about and continue to. And people ask us questions about it all the time. And, like I said, we in California, we change our laws all the time. We don't feel like anything is static. So, I do think there is, if this isn't working and we feel like leaving it in the hands of the deployer and the developer after the agency has done this, and I think, are a state that would rethink that. But that competition in the market was really important to me.
Thank you, Rebecca. A quick follow-up in that discussion around third-party assessment and verification. Did the idea of the state providing an automated service for assessment ever come up?
Yeah, I saw that was somebody, I thought, put that in the chat. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we have, and there are companies or nonprofits, I think, that are even starting to do this, to create tools. We, and I'm assuming many of you agree with California on this one, we don't legislate to a certain company. We don't create laws that benefit one entity. But we, obviously innovation happens around what we require. So, I think that we thought our goal was to set out the parameters of what we want, what we expect, what the agency is going to be asking for and looking at, and then how they do that, whether it's with a third-party tool or whatever, will really be up to them. And I don't think we have a preference as long as they meet the requirements of the law.
Thank you.
But I think it's an interesting idea, and I'd heard this about sort of having the agency certify certain tools to make it easier. And, is that something the agency would do down the road? I don't know that I think it's a bad idea. And it's interesting that, one more thing, Nick, and then I will turn to you.
Yes, go
Senator,
ahead.
you said something about the privacy agency. You'll see in the bill, we also, we were really focused on the civil rights agency, because privacy is an important piece of this, but we really are so focused on the disparate impact piece. We wanted civil rights to be the one helping to define how we decide these things. Okay, Nick.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick up on that point, Senator, Assemblywoman, and thank you for your presentation and your service. I'm a little different perspective than other people. I'm an industry person, and everything you've said is absolutely spot on. But you have to remember the context in which all this is occurring. We've created all of these problems for 60, 70, 80, 100 years, especially when we talk about these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, you can try to kind of use this shining star or shining object to kind of right all of the issues of the past. That's going to be very, very difficult and very challenging. The fact that we don't use diversity, equity, and inclusion is the problem as we innovate. And as you're thinking in California of putting these tools in place or putting these authorities in place, I mean, that's where it starts. Put diversity and equity and inclusion into those authorities. Don't let tools be built that don't have all backgrounds of all people of all forms, included. We seem to, we constantly do what we've been doing, hoping that the outcome will become different. And so I've written a book. It's called If Nothing Changes, Nothing Changes. Your husband would like it. I'm not so sure you would like it, because it's a bit of a tech book. But seriously, please keep context in mind, as you're doing this work and regulating. If you don't make those things change into something different, you're gonna just keep getting what they've been giving you. And we don't want that. So I'm not as deathly afraid of AI as a lot of other people are, only because maybe I know too much. At least I think I know too much. But keep up the good work. I'm really impressed with what you've been able to do out there. Thank you for your service. And if you want to make a difference here, then you got to make a difference and start with something different. Don't keep going back to the same processes or companies or approaches that got us to where we are. Change it now. We'll clearly use this advice, or at least I will be a voice for this advice here in Connecticut. I hope you can be a voice for this advice in California.
I love that, Nick. And I think that it really touches on the point of, these tools are only as good as the data sets that go into them, right? We know that. That is how they are defined. And there are a lot of conversations around data sets. And as you think about areas like healthcare, right, where, the data sets are so biased, right? I mean, people of color do not get the same healthcare as other communities. And so as we're feeding in these data sets that contain that bias, we need to be really, really concerned. And so how much do you regulate the data sets and ensuring disclosures? And I know that's a big conversation, but I think it really gets to the heart of what you're saying, which is if we feed in this information that builds on every historic inequity, we are going to be stuck in those historic inequities. And so really, I think there are ways that we can use these tools and use our regulation of these tools to try to break those boundaries. And interestingly, if we force certain things in certain data sets, they're going to have to create those data sets, which will mean changing the status quo to get the data. So I think there is opportunity.
And thanks, Nick. You're underselling your book. I'm almost halfway. Well, I'm on page I think I got to 170 this morning or so. 160, 170. I have a flight tonight, so I plan on reading another 50 or so pages. But I will tell you, Rewired was much harder to read than your book is. Rewired was more of a manual for CEOs, so it was denser. Yours is a nice story, and agreed. If nothing changes, nothing changes, right? But what we're doing here is we're not going to change the world with our legislation, but the world is changing, and we need to make sure it's changing for the good, and that's the way we need to all contribute to that. Scott had a question in the in the chat. So in the CA legislation, it looks like impact assessment is defined as a documented risk-based evaluation of an automated decision tool. Can you speak to what is being done to identify tools that could be used as impact assessments? Is California developing one, or are you relying on a list of vetted solutions?
So we haven't gotten that far. I think that we're gonna, we're really wanting to rely on agency expertise there. I'm a big believer in using the scope of my expertise and then the scope of others. So we haven't gotten to that point yet where we figured that out. Again, we're defining the scope of what will be required, and then how that's achieved, I think, will come at a later date, and using the expertise of Civil Rights Agency, Privacy Agency, and others to help us figure that out and vet it.
And that has been something I've seen, one of the, not necessarily criticism, but something that's been brought up about the EU AI Act is there's really no specificity around what's in the impact assessments. So
right.
And
it's important. You want them to be meaningful and good, but you don't want them to be too onerous, right? There's a balance.
Right. How do we strike that balance? And so I'll definitely want to stay in touch with you. To
Yeah, I'd
Vahid's
love that.
point about the definitions for the multi-state working group, I know Stephanie has been
Yes.
setting in on the multi-state working group. The next thing we're doing is we're going to be going over definitions. So we took your definitions from AB 331, the executive order, EU AI Act. We're trying to pull out a lot of the definitions from the bills to see if we can come up with a standardized list of definitions that we can share with lawmakers in the different states as everyone's trying to figure out. At least we can work off of the same, but I'm definitely looking to you for a lot of the definition to make sure that we're going to comply, be interoperable.
And what have you all, the working group, met with the EU on this?
Yes.
Okay, good. They've been incredible. They opened an office out here in San Francisco, so they're very easy for us to meet with now, and it's been so helpful to meet with them regularly and get updates and their thinking. And
it was actually Delegate Maldonado connected us with someone from the EU. It was her friend. So we had someone from Portugal present to their.
Okay. Well, so so interestingly, they opened, I think they have a US office in DC, but also here in California now. And the California one is focused on tech policy. And so they have been an incredible resource. So if you want to talk to them too, they constantly update me on what's happening, and it's been great because I do think we have multinational, international companies here, right, that are going to have to comply with them and us. And I think the more we know and share, the better. So I'm glad you met with them, and if you want more, we're happy to.
Yeah, I would love that connection. And as you know, a lot of the companies that put out their proposed framework, in the Google proposed framework, the Amazon proposed framework, they all, even I think in the Microsoft as well, they say stay international, right? Like looking at making sure that we're looking, because it doesn't stop at country borders. So any connection you have, I would appreciate that. And thank you so much for your time and presenting to us today.
Thanks for doing this. It was great to be here.
Thank you. And next, we have Dia Nguyen from Amazon. Dia is, okay, great, she's there. Dia was recently named one of the, by Business Insider's list of the top 100 people in AI. She frequently publishes. She's been at presented at numerous conferences. Unfortunately, we were supposed to be on a panel together when I was on a panel with Chloe, and unfortunately, Dia was unable to make that. I was really looking forward to meeting her, but again, and I'm very excited to have her present here to talk about inclusive AI. Dia?
Thank you so much, Senator Maroney. I am excited to be here with you all today, in part not just because this is my job, but also because it's an area of passion for me. It's been good to hear the conversations and just know that there are folks that are being, thoughtful and intentional about how we can build technology better that has a better sort of impact for our for society. And I'm excited about the work that I've been able to pioneer here at AWS, but also participate in as we work with our customers. So I'm excited to be able to share some of that work today. And hopefully you all are seeing my screen just fine. And one of the things, I said this is an area of passion for me, so I'll just start off very quickly with a sort of brief connection to my experience and how I transitioned specifically into this work around responsible AI. One is that my background is in technology, and we've heard a number of people talk about like access and how important access is. And for me, access and exposure to a computer in the 3rd grade was what shifted my mindset in terms of being a computer engineer. That's what I went to school for. Coming from a family of teachers, right? And so a whole different world, something sort of outside of the norm, but that access and that exposure is what made the shift for me. Now, some 20 years into my career, I have sons, and I was really looking at, what do we need to teach them? Or are we giving them all that they need to prepare them for the future, right? So understand that I'm a technologist, I'm working in cloud technology, and I was looking at what they're learning in schools and thinking, I don't know if this is everything they need to know to prepare them for tomorrow. And there are a couple of things that sort of resonated, at least in the things that I was exploring about 5-6 years ago. The first was data, right? This sort of new drive to big data and data driving better decisions and being, a catalyst for shifting organizations so that they could be data-centered companies. Artificial intelligence and robotics, that reshaping the world of automation, actually shaping and making a shift in terms of the ways in which people were working and the jobs and the opportunities that we have. And then, of course, the other sort of area was around extended reality. I understand this is a few years ago, and extended reality may not be still at the height of trends, but still something that is shaping and reshaping how we work, right? How we engage. And one of the things that I found, one was that there were an absence of voices and people that looked like my sons, right? In that, and then certainly some of the implications in areas of risk that can be exacerbated or mounted on those that are underserved, underrepresented, and marginalized. And I thought that this was a great opportunity, one, for me to have a voice coming, with my background in technology, but also in the company where I work, right? That we have hundreds and thousands of customers that are building, or probably more than that, building on top of our AI ML services. And we have this wealth of experience, hundreds of data scientists and others. And what would it look like for us to be able to lean in and help our customers as they build much more inclusively and responsibly? So that's actually what started the work a number of years ago, 4 years ago, in building a practice focused on responsible AI, helping our customers build, understand the areas of potential risk, and to help them put in place the practices necessary in order to be able to minimize those risks and maximize the business, not maximize the benefits, hopefully not just to the business, but also to society at large. So what I'll do today is to step through a little bit of what AWS's strategy is around a responsible AI. And then I want to hone in just a little bit on the way in which we talk about this and unpack this for our customers, because that's really where the trickle-down effect comes, not just the work that we're doing, but and the way that we're building, but also the way that we're equipping and supporting our customers that reach customers and hundreds of thousands of your constituents as well. Now, I've heard a couple of people say this, and I know that this is often a grounding slide for me, but just to help create a picture, AI is transforming, or I should probably say has transformed the way in which we work. So we heard someone earlier today talk about, like, in the 1950s when AI was being created. The reality is, and I think this is one of the areas of my purpose and work, is help increase awareness, because I don't think that people realize how much AI has already transformed the way in which we work, the way in which we engage with people, even it's, informing who we interact with in social media and other platforms. It has transformed our businesses and industries, and we're expecting that to increase. And so they talk about now its expectation to be in the adding, trillions of dollars to our GDP over the course of by 2025 and 2030, right? It's been reshaping how we interact in the world. And there, of course, are implications to that, which means that we have to be much more intentional about the way in which we're building, right? Intentional so that we can build in ways that are inclusive, responsible, safe, and secure. And this is, in part the catalyst for, as I mentioned, the work and the focus around responsible AI. There is an increasing number of companies in industry, and there have been a number of studies that have suggested that these executives are much more aware of areas of risk. And back in 2019, Deloitte did a study actually that said that while there was increasing awareness and understanding of the risk, there was still a gap in terms of organizations having the know-how, the skill, and even resources in order to be able to address those areas of risk. And I think that's also, again, one of those unique opportunities that we have, and being able to help our customers close that gap, right? What they were calling the preparedness gap. A much more recent study, and I believe it was from McKinsey, that actually stated that now there's only, while people are putting in place initiatives or in allocating, a portion of their strategy to responsible AI, that they only about 35% of those are actually doing the work in the sense of like making this strategic initiative practical and doing and actually instituting this in this organization. So this is a good place for us in terms of an integration point. To be able to help our customers, the number of customers that are coming to us, one, to help them realize new opportunities, to gain operational efficiencies, to innovate, that we get to now also partner with them in building the kind of operating approach that is that looks at what we need to do from a cultural perspective, because this really is organizational change in many ways. I liken this to what we were talking about in the early days around cloud and adopting the cloud. If you just think about some of the benefits of the cloud, it's not sufficient enough just to say that I take my applications that were running in a server on premise and move that to the cloud and think that we gain the benefit of all that the cloud provides. It required some transformation. That's the same model that we talk about when we think about this from a responsible AI. In order for us to get the greatest value out of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and to ensure that we minimize the risk, we need to think about how we incorporate people, process, and technology into a culture of responsibility that allows us to reduce those risks, unintended impact, and maximize the benefit. From an AWS perspective, we established a strategy that focuses on these four sort of key components or four areas. And this is, a strategic imperative for us, much like what we are recommending for others, that responsible AI needs to be integral into the way in which organizations are adopting AI overall. First, this sort of transforming responsible AI theory to practice. There's a lot that's been in studies and research, and we want to actually do the work to make sure that we can take those concepts, understand that, and put that theory into practice so that responsible AI is integrated into the entire machine learning lifecycle, and to ensure that wherever they are or wherever our teams are in the process, that they have the tools and systems, understanding best practices in order to be able to integrate that into the way in which they work. And the responsible AI being integrated into the entire machine learning lifecycle is important because oftentimes you will hear people talk about like this notion of reducing risk, minimizing bias, ensuring transparency as only functions that are assigned to those that are in technical roles, right? The data scientist or the machine learning engineer. But this is a responsibility that we all have, right? So to ensure that a product manager, for instance, is actually thinking about whether or not we're considering all of the consumers, all of the stakeholders, and making sure we're designing for that, bringing in those inclusive voices, making sure that when we're looking at data sources that we have ethically sourced data and that data is representative of the populations that we intend to serve or the consumers that we intend to provide a product for. And that goes through the entire life cycle. And so that has to be integral in the way in which we're building AI products and services. And I'll double down on this a little bit more in our conversation as well, is to talk about nurturing the next generation of diverse leaders. And you all were just talking about like the value and importance of diversity. There are a number of studies, and we've kind of known this for a while, right? That talks about the improvement, the cognitive intelligence being increased for our teams, the outperformance, what we see in the way of outperforming, organizations that have diversity, not just in their boards, but also in their teams. The sort of increased employee engagement benefits are wide-reaching. And we understand that in order to be able to address some of the areas of concern and risk, that we also need to be investing in a next generation of leaders. That 26% that you said were women, right, for AI and technology roles. when we look at that across people of color, in particular, those of African descent or Black, we're talking about roughly in the 2 to 3%. And then for those of Hispanic or Latino origin, Latin Americans, that is about 6%, right? So there is a huge disparity there that we've been committed to focusing on. We do this sort of people-centered focus and, focus on education comes in a number of ways, right? One is the company has made a commitment to educate 29 million in cloud individuals by 2025 across cloud technology, which also includes our machine learning services. And there are a number of programs that we've developed as well, in order to be able to sort of bring that to life that I'll talk a little bit more about in a slide or two. And then the final sort of area is advancing the science of responsible AI. Now, we weren't talking about responsible AI or ethical or trustworthy AI. Most people use those terms interchangeably. We weren't talking about that more than 5 years ago. And there's still a lot to be done. And now when we think about what's happening with generative AI and some of the complexity around deep learning models and large language models, some of the things around transparency or our explainability, how we address bias, are still areas of active research. And we're investing in research in that area as well, so that those are the same kind, the what we're unpacking and discovering are things that we can bring into the organization that inform how we build, but also how we help to educate and support our customers as well. So this is an example of a couple of the services. I talked about like not just being a technology focus for responsible AI, but the same is true that this is not just a point solution. Responsible AI should be considered a point solution. It requires an end-to-end approach that we're looking at across the entire life cycle, from procuring data, what we look at in design, development, deployment, and ongoing use. And we have services now that we're providing to help our customers better detect bias in their data sets and in their models, to provide insight into like model predictions, to better monitor the models that are in production and understand that, as well as look at things to incorporate greater automation and human oversight. So these kinds of services, and some of these are mentioned here, are ways in which we bring our technology services, some of the research that we're doing, best practices, guidance, as well as resources in terms of our people resources and experts, to be able to walk and work with our customers to actually benefit them as they look at taking what is theory and what has been talked about in science and make that practice. We often hear people refer to this as operationalizing responsible AI. Now we have, I think probably over 100 experts at this particular point that are committed to responsible AI in various areas of the organization, including teams that are like in our professional services that are working with our Generative AI Innovation Center that are, providing guidance and expertise to support the work that we're doing in terms of the way in which we're building, but also with our customers. And I think this is one of those areas, again, that we get to benefit in conversations like this as well, right? Supporting those in public policy, working with some of think tanks and other areas of academia to help advocate for responsible AI, balanced legislation, but also the kinds of best practices that will help us to build much more safe and secure AI systems, and ones that are minimizing the risk. And then we also have, like a group of fellows that we bring up that come from academia, some leading thinkers and researchers that become Amazon fellows that work alongside of our service teams to help bring their sort of research expertise, marry that with the expertise from industry to help us, address some of the challenges as we build. This is where I wanted to focus on, some of the work that we've been doing in the area of of education, and this commitment again to help grow tech skills of 29 million people around the world. This focus and commitment to education. And I think this is important because you probably have heard from, our company, and certainly with what we've seen in the way of generative AI, it's put technology in the hands of everyone in some ways and made that accessible. And I think the same is true, that we need to make AI education, and even responsible AI education, accessible to everyone. So one of the programs that has been great is, and it's listed here, Machine Learning University. It's providing actually education enablement to educators with a priority for community colleges, minority serving institutions, and historically Black colleges and universities. And the intent is that these educators then can take the knowledge of the same courses and content that we're providing internally to our teams as well, to be able to leverage those to build standalone courses, certificate programs, full degrees in data management, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Last year, we announced the AI ML Scholarship Program, and this was done in partnership with Intel and Udacity, in order to be able to help provide artificial intelligence and machine learning education to prepare underrepresented high school and college students for careers in that area. And to date, we've educated roughly 21,000 individuals here in the US. And then something like AWS Deep Racer. This is a fully autonomous race car that is being used to teach people machine learning in a fun sort of way. And we've educated more than 320,000 developers, over 160 companies, right? So these are some of the ways in which we're making AI accessible. But this is just an example of a few of those initiatives that specifically focused on AI. I think what we were hearing and some of the concern is, when we understand that jobs will be displaced, and we're sort of creating this new world of roles and opportunities, that we focus on how do we upskill and reskill our internal resources that are beginning to work alongside technology, that we think about the inclusion of AI in our strategy as being one that is augmenting human capability and not entirely replacing them, and that we are advocating for the kind of sort of skills and workforce initiatives that actually support people developing and giving them access to education, so that they can understand better how the skill that they have in different industries can actually be leveraged along with technology. And there are discussions that we're having with folks like, there's a group called Jobs for the Future, right in DC, that is doing some research and work there that I participate on as part of advisory, to also think about and help us unpack, like, how do we also continue to be part of that broader solution? Now, I talked about like this, new world of how we are looking at AI responsibly, and generative has increased some of those considerations for us right now. Questions of intellectual property and sort of making this question about addressing bias and fairness a little bit more complex than before, and that's why this focus on research and development is so important. We know that the scientific field of responsible and trustworthy ethical AI is constantly evolving, just like our research and advancements in AI broadly are. And we are, partnering with organizations like the National Science Foundation in order to provide grants and research specifically around fairness. Working with in strategic partnership with the University of California, MIT, University of Washington, and others, right, to continue to collaborate with academia in these areas of research as well. And then some of the partnerships that we have with folks like the OECD and others, trying to advance ISO and IEEE, being a part of those conversations to advance some of the standards and best practices in those areas. Now, the last bit I want to focus on is talking a little bit about like how we think about this as we partner with our customers. This is how we make this real, right? The first part is the strategy and the work that we do in terms of how we're building, then how do we scale what we are focused on internally to our customers. And there are these 7 core principles that we developed and used as a foundation for our discussions with our customers, but also to help them unpack and look at areas where they need to focus on as they build. And I'll highlight a few of these. The first is values. And I think this is important because, you know, I've had a customer or two who were thinking about using AI in certain use cases and didn't actually think about how that might violate what they say their core premise or beliefs are. An example that I often use is one where an organization was looking to gain intelligence from inmate calls and didn't necessarily want to respond or were questioning whether or not they should respond if they found out that an inmate would potentially do harm to themselves or someone was at risk of harm that was uncovered. And one of the core sort of tenets on their website said that they value inmate well-being. Well, in that particular use case, right, that could very well, the gathering of intelligence might be useful to help them with other crimes, et cetera. But if it actually violates one of your core tenets, then maybe this is a use case that's inappropriate for you, or you need to think about how you implement this. And that was one of those examples. Inclusion, and we've talked about this and other people have mentioned this, and Senator Maroney, you mentioned this as well, the value of having diversity and inclusion. And I talk about this like in the context of having the voice and perspective of those, right, that are going to be meaningful or that will be impacted by the technology. And the example that I use often to describe this is around seatbelts. We know seatbelts had good intentions, initially designed because for and based off of men. 80% of the drivers in the 1950s were men, and they were designed as such, tested based on male specifications. And there have been studies for a number of years that showed, increased harm and injury to women and children. Because they didn't think about the 20%, the outliers, right? That 20% that were women, we designed for the 80%. In a lot of cases that works, right? But this increase of harm, something that was intended for good that had an unintended consequence because we didn't think about or didn't consider the other consumers and then the stakeholders, other stakeholders, the children that were in the car. And it's taken us a number of years to even get to the point of having like design specifications for female aligned dummies to even test with. 2021 was where we finally like put the stake in the ground here in the US, right? And I don't think that we can afford that, especially in the ways in which AI is impacting so many different areas of industry and people's livelihoods. So inclusion is important. And we may not have every voice and individual represented, but doing the work to go back to some of those traditional methods of human or people-centered design actually help us to be able to unpack the kind of personas and make sure that we're thinking about the right people that need to be included, or the right stakeholders that are impacted. In addition to thinking about how we bring those voices to, and have those individual seats at the table. Training and education has to be critical. And we were talking about that from two perspectives. One is making sure that we're educating people so that they understand the ways in which they have to address areas of bias or think about transparency and safety in the overall design. But then that's the other part that we're talking about in the augmented workforce that we're advocating for. How do we help people to want to understand and bring their own skill and perspective to the work that they're doing? Somebody mentioned earlier this example in healthcare, and I'll just share this briefly. The reason why I wasn't able to join you at NCL earlier this year was my father had a stroke and was in the hospital. And this particular hospital here in Maryland uses AI, and AI suggested a certain issue that was the cause of his stroke. And one of the technicians said to me that, your father has stenosis. When I talked to the chair of the department who was actually attending my father, she was like, absolutely not, right? She said that was the likely cause of this. But when we look at all of the factors, and then she started pulling up all the scans and different images of my father's brain and all of that sort of stuff, she said, he doesn't have stenosis at all. AI is wrong here. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm a technologist. I know that there are opportunities where AI has greater accuracy and efficiency, but sometimes there are those conditions on the outliers, right? The outlying conditions, just like we were talking about with AI, with the other technology, that we have to pay attention to. And this is where it's valuable and important to help educate our folks that you bring your expertise to the table as well, that we don't abandon those. And this is one of those great sort of areas of both training and education and accountability that come together, right? Because she recognized that AI isn't just because it's AI or just because it's a technology that we take its recommendation above all else. And she still brings her expertise and understanding to bear. And that kind of human involvement and oversight is often essential, especially when we talk about high-risk use cases. So that's where we touch on accountability. How do we unpack and understand the areas of impact? So impact assessments, understanding like the risk of certain use cases, and we really define what is the level of accountability, the level of human oversight that's necessary, and making sure those lines are clear and understood in the early stages of our design and implementation of systems. Privacy, safety, and security, exactly that, right? Making sure that we can ensure the quality and integrity of the data that we're using, that we have like appropriate access, that we're making sure that we're considering things to safeguard the environment, the platform, the data, the algorithms themselves. Equity and fairness is the technical elements of ensuring that we are building systems that don't have a difference in its performance or significant difference in the performance for certain subgroups, whether that is, people of different ethnic backgrounds or age or sexual orientation or ability, that we're building systems that are going to provide the sort of equitable and fair outcomes overall. And that means putting in, technical tools that help us to measure for fairness as well. And one of the key parts in this, and I've shared this often, is actually working with our customers to define what is fair in the beginning, right? So what we've been finding is that we don't actually do the work to do that. And so later on, there's this question of, well, we didn't recognize, and that's where many of the use cases occur. We didn't recognize, plan and design for, nor test for, the kind of equal results across different subgroups. And so we had some, unintended outcome. One of the areas where I think this matters is for instance, like with, I'll give you a healthcare use case. It's a company that has been using AI, and it's been able to, with models, determine within 15 months of clinical manifestation, the likelihood of heart disease. And heart disease, as you probably know, is the #1 killer of people of all demographics here in the US. Right. So imagine the ability to be able to reduce the number of people that die every day from heart disease, because we can now provide preventative care. So being able to test for that, right, and make sure that across different subgroups that we can still provide the same sort of result and prediction. But then the other part of this sort of equity and fairness is ensuring that in its implementation and deployment, do we think about like who actually gets access to the preventative care? Do we do the right things in terms of its implementation, that it's not something that's only provided to those that have private insurance, but it's something that folks that are on Medicaid or Medicare also get access to, right? Which would be more of our underserved or underrepresented individuals oftentimes, or those of lower economic status. How do we ensure that in this implementation that like insurance companies don't use this now earlier information in ways that will limit access to insurance or provide higher rates, right? And all of that has to be part of the sort of holistic look at making sure that the implementation of AI is fair, not just in its design or its creation. And of course, transparency and explainability. And we were talking about this earlier across a number of the standards, as well as a lot of the legislation posed, not just here in the US, but other places. Transparency is being a major consideration, that we can be informed of when we're interfacing with systems. We understand the ways in which it's making decisions that we're abdicating some of those decisions to the system as opposed to individuals making them themselves, but also that we can understand some of those outcomes. So this is the structure that we use to actually unpack the considerations for a customer. And then the last thing that I'll say is that, this is complex. You could probably say that this is a lot of stuff that we now have to contend with. And I understand, especially in this new context where we have this, people are calling the AI race, right? People are excited and energetic, rushing almost to being one of the first movers or to have the competitive advantage. And we recognize that this is a journey. We don't expect that every customer, as soon as we bring in that list, implements every single one of those things across all those areas. Some people are earlier in their journey in terms of their adoption of AI. But what we try to, one, remind people is that it's a journey, that we start off with building awareness, and that's across the organization. We build as established foundational elements like having roles and responsibilities, being clear about lines of accountability, doing the kind of impact assessment, and move to the area where we have a much more integrated sort of system where AI and responsible AI is just the way in which we build. And we believe that's the foundation of building trust with our customers. But also that helps and has a trickle-down impact in terms of people having trust in the technology, right? Not just in the product that we build, but also the technology as a whole, and can see themselves in being able to use and adopt it in broader ways, because it is in fact helping us solve some of the previously unattainable problems, as well as making our lives efficient. We all, use that next word recommendation where we're texting or when we're using our emails. We use it every day out, navigating the streets. We interface with AI every day when we call customer service for any organization and talk to that voice automated system. In many ways, it's increasing efficiency, and we expect that it's going to continue to do so as long as we can build in inclusive and responsible ways.
Dia, thank you very much for your presentation. And I hope your father is recovering.
Yes, thank you. I told him, I was like, you're in all of my stories now, like in my presentations. Yeah, he didn't mean to like give me content, but I think that doctor, for me, it was just a great example of like the partnership of AI, but also why it's so important. She has expertise that she brings to bear, and she's not going to put that on the shelf because the system says something, right? And then this also sort of notion of like, oftentimes AI is optimized for the majority, right? And so we have to think about like those on the outliers, on the fringes, and make sure that we're considering those. He happens to be a fringe use case, and I'm grateful for the doctor who knew to look at all the factors and bring her intelligence, to the table, and that oversight, because she was engaged, right, was critically important.
Right. Thank you. I do see Dave has a question.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. And yeah, I'm glad your father's doing well. I'm wondering, from my perspective, the transparency and explainability piece seems to come first, just in the way I think about these things, because how can you know if AI is being deployed responsibly if there isn't transparency? How can you know if there is accountability, or if the training and education is working, if there is no transparency about what is taking place? So I'm just wondering if you could speak to Amazon's commitment to transparency in terms of allowing third parties to have access to your models, being able to run those models to ensure that they're not worsening bias, they're not being discriminatory, that the outcomes are responsible. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, Amazon, and I'll talk about AWS specifically because there's a little distinction there.
Sure.
Yes, but so I know that AWS, and we have participated in some cases where we have some third-party access. I think that we also have stepped in and leaned into areas of transparency in the way in which we're building and creating service cards. So you think about model cards as a sort of construct. Service cards for us is for each one of our services. And we're creating these to provide, greater sort of visibility into the ways in which we've tested its performance, intended use, recommendations for how you optimize that. And it's based on application use case, because in part, the model cards themselves, when we have a service that has multiple models, will not provide the same set of context for our customers. Another area kind of focus to be able to sort of share and provide transparency is around, our now tools providing for our customers who are building upon our services as well, the ability to generate model cards, right, so that they could provide that transparency to our customers, and then participating in, other work with NIST and other entities to be able to have that kind of sort of third-party visibility is another area of focus.
Thank you for that. And just could you speak in broader terms about I'm sorry, I had my notes in front of me and my dog started going a little bonkers in the background. You mentioned earlier about advancing the science behind this and how requires sharing of the models, and I guess this is kind of tied to my earlier question. And it is actually kind of related to your experience with the doctor's office. When Google came out with an AI piece of software that said that they could detect cancerous cells early, they were not allowing other researchers access to that model, so then they could then verify whether or not that data was something that could be useful. And so there seems to be some disconnect between the need to have third party, not just necessarily verification, but for research purposes, right? So if there's some sort of research that could be useful in a lot of different ways and applicable in different kind of health settings or whatever kind of setting it might be, that there's this tension between the need to be transparent about how you got that data and wanting to withhold how you got that data for proprietary reasons. So I'm just wondering if you could speak more broadly about that from your perspective.
Yeah. So, I think that is one of, I think there's often a distinction, and I know that's one of the areas where is in particular around data that becomes, a consideration, because data sources in some ways are, part of proprietary information when training models. What we've tried to do, and in particular with our customers specifically, is, in some cases training with public data sets and being able to, provide them, better context and understanding of how it might perform, or, what representation is, what the relative performance is across those with, public data sets, so they could sort of look at apples to apples. I think the one challenge is, right, we're providing services that other people are building upon. So think about like the model then, or a sort of foundational service. It in application, it's not the same once you've married your data, trained it for a specific purpose in an application. And that's where the sort of distinction between developer and deployer comes in, as the deployer, those organizations that are building upon then have different performance, right? They're going to have in some cases could be starkly different depending on the marrying of their data and their application context. So I think that there needs to be work on both sides in terms of the sort of transparency and understanding there. Go back to, you were saying something about Google. I want to make sure I get to
just being able to verify, like if some sort of research comes out that is indicating some pretty promising results, but it's unable to nobody's able to verify it because they're not having access to the model that created those results.
Yeah. So I think like having these test frameworks and opportunities, one for the kind of transparency that we're talking about, where we can provide context for how we build. Customer or deployer also has the opportunity to provide that context, and then having test frameworks that we use to be able to expose some of those results, I think is the ways in which we get to greater transparency. Then some of the use cases are requiring us to be able to, or organizations to be able to provide like context for decisions that are being made, and how in New York with automated decision making and hiring, right, it's requiring some greater sort of visibility and auditing in those use cases. And I think those kinds of requirements are going to expose and create the additional visibility that we need also.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Nick?
Sure. Diane, great presentation.
Thank you.
Very impressive background, by the way. You've come a long way from Spelman, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Great job. And AWS is fortunate to have you. A little tougher set of questions, though, along the line that David was talking about. You are a service provider. That's what you do. I mean,
Yes.
you are an enabler for other people to do business. What will you, as AWS, actually walk away from business? Will you say to people, you know what? We know what you're trying to do. That's totally bogus. That isn't going to work unless you change. We don't want you. Or if you find out that they're doing that along the way, and you constantly monitor for your services in order to keep your service level commitments up. Will you take actions appropriately as a company?
Yes, yes. So we have terms of service, and in addition to that, with a recent release of like our generative AI service, we also have additional terms that apply to our AI services as well, and absolutely are, prepared to, and have done in some cases, even with like the general cloud, have had to act where there were circumstances where there were violations of those terms of service. So absolutely, and I think that there are cases where we don't have as much visibility. So like I will give an example that the work that we do, my team and others, we're working directly with an enterprise customer, so we have visibility into the way in which they're building. Probably I would say something like 80% of our customers, or maybe even more, don't interface with professional services, right? Are not working directly with our consultants or our solution architects. They get to go to the console, spin up services, build on their own, right? Bring in their developer teams, of which we don't have a lot of direct interaction with. And so, it is more the uncovering of those situations that would be necessary in order for us to be able to take action, but absolutely prepared to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I'm a technologist too, guys, so you have to be careful with me. I think those are services that you're probably going to have to spin up, at some point in time. You're going to inherit a lot of liability that you're not going to be able to deal with. So I'm encouraged by you and what you're saying and the approach that you hopefully are influencing AWS. I hope they listen to you, because there's a ditch on both sides of this road, and I'm sure you understand that very well.
I hear you. Yes. And to your point, I think that as there is, other sort of regulatory or considerations, those are things that we absolutely have to, comply with. And, some of the White House commitments, around that kind of transparency, being able to share with other, industry leaders. We were one of those. I think it's also going to help, in establishing this shared understanding of some of the areas of risk, like the move towards watermarking, et cetera, that will be necessary.
Good luck to you, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Great, Dia. Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't see any further questions, so I think that'll bring us to the end of today's meeting. I would let you know that our next meeting, December 13th, is going to be a hybrid meeting. So we will be in person. The Yale School of Engineering is hosting us. Nick, I forgot I had asked another speaker, so we may have to start at 12:30 instead of 1. So we will be going from 12:30 to 5. We have a number of speakers lined up. We're going to be focused both on workforce, but then also on health tech. And so one of the businesses, Sandra Soldana of Alva Health, which does stroke detection. We will have Scott Lowry from Connecticut Health AI. And then at the end of that meeting, we're going to break out into 2 separate roundtables, one focused on health tech and one focused on workforce development, before we come back to a meeting, and then we'll come back to close the meeting together and report out. We are also working on a tour of a facility in the New Haven area. We're trying to confirm that for 5:30, as well as a small reception or happy hour for the people who want to stay and visit that business, and then we can meet each other in person, because we've been virtual, I think, this this whole time for people who are able to do so. So again, that's December 13th. It'll be the whole afternoon that day. But if you have any questions or suggestions before then, please do reach out. The legislative session starts in February. We are looking to have our last meeting in January of this. And Case is doing a study for us. They will be reporting on the results of that study around workforce skills, and both what are employers looking for, what are we teaching, and they will be presenting on that at the January 10th meeting, as well as we will go over kind of a summary of everything we've discussed and make some vote on some general recommendations for legislation. So thank you everyone for attending and have a great day.
Thank you, Senator, for hosting us again. All the best, everyone. Happy
Thanks, Nick.
Happy Thanksgiving as well.
Oh
to
yeah,
everyone.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yes.
Happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Yeah.
Thanksgiving.